Get ready, because what you're about to hear isn't just another legal update. It's something that could quietly change the way your rights work, without you even realizing it. Imagine this for a second. You're carrying legally. You've done everything right. You followed the rules, you stayed informed, at least you thought you did. Then one small legal shift, one new interpretation. And suddenly, without changing anything about your behavior, you may be on the wrong side of the law. Not because you intended to break it, not because you were reckless, but because the law changed and you didn't know. And here's the real question I want you to answer in the comments. Do you believe it's your responsibility alone to keep up with every legal change? Or should the state be required to clearly notify citizens when those changes can turn lawful behavior into a legal risk? Think about that. Because this isn't just a debate, it's a real issue that affects real people. Now let's talk about what's actually happening in Florida, and why this matters more than most people realize. Florida has long been considered one of the more permissive states when it comes to firearm laws. Over the years, it built a framework that many lawful gun owners became comfortable with. Concealed carry systems, clear licensing structures, and more recently, the shift toward permitless carry. But here's where things get complicated. Legal systems don't always change in obvious ways. Sometimes the law itself doesn't dramatically shift, but how it's interpreted, enforced, or applied begins to evolve. And in my legal analysis, that's where the real risk begins. Because when interpretation changes, even slightly, it can expand legal exposure in ways that most ordinary citizens never anticipate. Courts, prosecutors, and law enforcement agencies all play a role in shaping how laws are applied in real-world situations. And when their approach shifts, even subtly, the consequences can be significant. Now let's step into the constitutional framework for a moment. The Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms. That's a foundational principle. But it's also important to understand that this right is not absolute. The Supreme Court has consistently held that states can impose certain regulations, particularly when it comes to public safety, sensitive locations, and procedural compliance. There is a strong constitutional argument that any new restriction must align with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. Courts would likely examine whether a law reflects long-standing practices or introduces something entirely new and potentially overreaching. But here's where things become more layered. The United States operates under a dual legal system. Federal law sets a baseline, but states can go further. That means something that may be broadly acceptable under federal standards could still be restricted at the state level. And that creates a gap, one that often leads to confusion. In Florida's case, even when broader carry rights are expanded, specific limitations still exist, and those limitations are often where people run into trouble. For example, location-based restrictions remain one of the most common legal pitfalls. Certain places, like schools, government buildings, and designated sensitive areas, carry strict rules. In many real-world cases, individuals weren't charged because they possessed a firearm, but because of where they had it. And in my legal analysis, this is where many lawful gun owners underestimate their risk. They focus on the right to carry, but overlook the conditions attached to that right. Now let's briefly touch on the Fourth Amendment. This amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. So when law enforcement interacts with someone carrying a firearm, the legality of that interaction matters. Courts would likely examine whether there was reasonable suspicion or probable cause for a stop or search. If that standard isn't met, evidence could be challenged. But if a person is found in violation of a clearly defined restriction, such as being in a prohibited area, those protections become much harder to rely on. The Fifth Amendment also comes into play, especially in real-world encounters. People often don't realize how quickly a simple conversation can turn into a legal issue. Statements made under pressure, even unintentionally, can later be used in court. And that's not about wrongdoing, it's about awareness. Understanding your rights isn't just about knowing what you can do. It's about knowing how to navigate a situation when something goes wrong. Now let's talk about the political reality. Gun laws in the United States are one of the most debated and evolving areas of law. On one side, there are strong arguments for public safety and adapting to modern risks. On the other, there's a deep concern about preserving constitutional rights. Supporters of regulatory changes argue that evolving conditions require updated frameworks. And that argument carries weight, especially in discussions around public safety. But critics raise a different concern. They argue that incremental changes, small adjustments over time, can gradually reshape the boundaries of a constitutional right. There is a strong constitutional argument that overly broad or unclear laws can raise serious due process concerns. Courts would likely examine whether an average citizen can reasonably understand what is allowed and what is not. If that clarity is missing, the law itself can become vulnerable to challenge. Now bring this back to the real world. What does this actually mean for a lawful gun owner? It means the biggest risk isn't always intentional misconduct. It's unintentional non-compliance. It's the moment where someone believes they're following the law but misses a technical detail. And in most legal systems, not knowing the law is not a valid defense. That's the reality. The consequences can include criminal charges, fines, loss of carry privileges, and long-term legal complications. And in many cases, it starts with something small: a misunderstanding, a missed update, a wrong assumption. In my legal analysis, the long-term trend is clear. The legal landscape is not becoming simpler. It's becoming more complex, which means the burden on individuals to stay informed is increasing, not decreasing. And that leads to a critical point. This isn't about fear. It's about awareness. It's about understanding that rights and responsibilities exist together. One cannot function properly without the other. If you choose to exercise a right, especially one as significant as firearm ownership, then understanding the legal environment around it becomes essential. Not optional, essential. So as this situation continues to evolve, the most responsible approach is not panic and not ignorance. It's education. It's staying updated. It's asking questions. It's engaging in informed, respectful discussion. Because in the end, the law doesn't just affect people who act recklessly. Sometimes it affects people who simply didn't realize something had changed. So take this seriously, stay informed, and be part of the conversation in a thoughtful and responsible way. And if you want more breakdowns like this, clear, balanced, and grounded in legal reasoning, make sure you're subscribed. Because understanding the law isn't just about information, it's about protection. And in a system that continues to evolve, the people who stay informed are the ones who stay ahead. Now, let's take this a step further. Because understanding the theory is one thing, but seeing how this plays out in real-world situations is where the risk becomes very real. Imagine a scenario. A lawful gun owner is driving through Florida. They're carrying legally under the state's current framework. They stop at a location they've visited dozens of times before. Maybe a public facility, maybe a place that recently updated its policies, or a location that falls under a restricted category they didn't fully recognize. Nothing about their behavior changes, but what they didn't realize is that the legal classification of that location, or the enforcement approach around it, has shifted. And in that moment, a completely lawful act can suddenly raise legal questions. In my legal analysis, this is one of the most underestimated risks in modern firearm law. Not dramatic violations, but quiet, technical ones. Courts would likely examine the totality of the circumstances. Where was the individual? What were the posted restrictions? Was the person aware, or should they reasonably have been aware? And that last part is critical, because the legal standard often isn't whether you actually knew, but whether you should have known. That's a much higher bar than most people expect. Now consider another situation, a routine interaction with law enforcement. Let's say an officer approaches someone based on a report or observation. The individual is cooperative, calm, and believes they are fully within their rights. But during the interaction, small details begin to matter. How the firearm is stored, whether it is being carried in a manner consistent with current regulations, whether the individual is in a location that introduces additional legal conditions. In many cases, these interactions don't escalate, but when they do, it's rarely because of one major issue. It's usually a combination of small factors, and in my legal analysis, this is where layered legal exposure becomes a real concern. One detail might not lead to a charge, but multiple technical issues combined together can create a situation that is much more serious. Now let's bring in Supreme Court precedent more directly. In recent years, the court has emphasized a historical tradition test when evaluating firearm regulations. That means laws are often measured against historical analogs, whether similar restrictions existed and were accepted in earlier periods of American history. There is a strong constitutional argument that this approach limits how far states can go when introducing new types of restrictions. But here's the complexity. Even when a law is ultimately challenged, that process takes time. And during that time, the law is still enforced. So from a practical standpoint, lawful gun owners are navigating a system where the legal boundaries may still be evolving and not yet fully settled. Courts would likely examine challenges carefully, but until a ruling is made, individuals are expected to comply with the law as it currently stands. And that creates a gap between legal theory and real-world reality. Now let's talk about enforcement patterns. In my legal analysis, enforcement is not always uniform. Different jurisdictions, different officers, and different circumstances can lead to very different outcomes. One person might receive a warning. Another, in a similar situation, might face charges. That inconsistency is not necessarily intentional, but it is part of how complex legal systems operate. And for the average person, that unpredictability increases the importance of staying well within clearly defined boundaries, not close to the line, well within it. Now consider the role of private property. Many people focus on public law, but private property rules can be just as important. Property owners often have the authority to restrict firearms on their premises. These restrictions may be posted, implied through policy, or enforced through trespassing laws. And this is where misunderstandings frequently happen. Someone may believe they are exercising a constitutional right, but on private property, different rules can apply. Courts would likely examine whether proper notice was given, whether the restriction was clear, and whether the individual complied once informed. Failure to comply in those situations can lead to legal consequences that have nothing to do with the Second Amendment itself, and everything to do with property law. Now let's shift to a broader perspective. Why does all of this matter in the long term? Because legal systems evolve gradually. Rarely do rights change overnight in obvious ways. Instead, they shift through a series of smaller developments, new interpretations, refined enforcement practices, incremental legislative updates. Individually, each change may seem minor, but over time, they can redefine how a right is experienced in practice. There is a strong constitutional argument that careful judicial oversight is necessary to ensure that these changes do not go beyond what the Constitution permits. At the same time, supporters of regulation argue that adapting to modern realities is necessary for public safety, and both perspectives are part of the ongoing legal conversation. This is not a simple issue with a single answer. It is a dynamic legal space where courts, lawmakers, and citizens all play a role. Now bring it back to the individual level. What should a responsible, law-abiding gun owner take away from all of this? In my legal analysis, the answer is not fear, it's precision. Precision in understanding where you can carry. Precision in how you carry. Precision in how you respond during interactions. Because the margin for error is not always as wide as people assume, and the cost of that error can be significant. This is why education matters more than ever. Not just general awareness, but detailed understanding. Not assumptions, but verified information. And not outdated knowledge, but current, accurate updates. Because in a system where interpretation can evolve, relying on what you learned years ago may not be enough. So as we continue forward, the key is not to react emotionally, but to think clearly, to stay informed, to stay responsible, to stay engaged in a way that is constructive and lawful, and most importantly, to recognize that rights are strongest when they are exercised with knowledge and discipline. If you've made it this far, take a moment to reflect on how much of this you already knew, and how much of it might have surprised you. Because that gap, that difference between assumption and reality, is exactly where legal risk begins. Stay aware, stay informed, and continue the conversation in a way that adds value, not noise. And remember, in a legal system that never stops evolving, the people who stay precise are the ones who stay protected. Now, let's go even deeper, because there's another layer to this that most people never think about until it's too late. And that's how quickly a normal situation can turn into a legal case. Think about how most legal problems actually begin. They don't start in a courtroom. They don't start with a major crime. They start with a moment, a conversation, an interaction, a misunderstanding. And in my legal analysis, firearm-related cases are often built the same way, not from dramatic intent, but from small, compounding details. Let's walk through that carefully. A lawful gun owner is approached. Maybe it's a routine inquiry. Maybe it's a response to a call. At that point, everything is still manageable. But then questions are asked. Where are you coming from? Do you have anything on you? Are you aware of where you are right now? Individually, these questions seem simple, but legally, every answer matters. Because once statements are made, they become part of the record. Courts would likely examine not just what was found, but what was said. And this is where the Fifth Amendment becomes more than just a concept. It becomes a real-world protection that many people don't fully understand how to use. You have the right to remain silent. That's well known. But what's less understood is how easily people waive that right without realizing it. They try to be helpful. They try to explain. They try to clarify. And in doing so, they may unintentionally create inconsistencies or provide information that complicates their situation. In my legal analysis, the safest approach in any legal interaction is not to panic, not to argue, but to remain calm, respectful, and aware of your rights. Because once something is said, it cannot be taken back. Now, let's connect this to another important principle: intent versus interpretation. Many people believe that if they had no bad intent, they should not face serious consequences. And from a moral perspective, that makes sense. But legally, things are not always that simple. Courts often focus on whether a law was violated, not necessarily why. Intent can matter in certain cases, but in regulatory frameworks, compliance itself is often the key issue. There is a strong constitutional argument that laws should be clear enough for ordinary people to follow without confusion. But when laws become complex, the line between intentional and unintentional violations becomes blurred, and that creates risk. Now let's talk about timing. Because another overlooked factor is how quickly laws and policies can take effect. A change can be passed, signed, and implemented within a relatively short period of time, and during that transition phase, not everyone is aware of the update. But enforcement does not always wait for awareness to catch up. Courts would likely examine whether the law was properly enacted and whether it was in effect at the time of the incident, not whether every citizen had time to fully understand it. And that's a critical distinction. Now consider how this connects to long-term legal exposure. One incident, even a minor one, can have ripple effects. Background checks, future licensing considerations, legal records that follow a person for years, and in some cases, consequences extend far beyond the original situation. In my legal analysis, this is why prevention is far more powerful than defense, because once a case begins, options become limited. Now let's shift slightly and look at how courts balance competing interests. On one side, there is the protection of constitutional rights. On the other, there is the responsibility of the state to maintain public safety, and courts are often placed in the position of weighing these two priorities. There is a strong constitutional argument that rights must be preserved and not gradually restricted through unclear or overly broad laws. At the same time, courts recognize that certain regulations can be justified if they are narrowly tailored and historically grounded. So the question becomes not whether regulation exists, but how far it goes and how clearly it is defined. And that's where many of the current debates are focused. Now let's bring this back to you, the viewer. Because all of this legal theory ultimately comes down to personal responsibility, not in a blaming sense, but in a practical sense. If you are operating within a system that is complex, evolving, and sometimes unclear, then your best protection is awareness, not assumptions, not outdated information, but active, ongoing understanding. And that requires effort. It means paying attention to updates. It means verifying information. It means not relying solely on what everyone else says. Because in legal matters, common belief is not always equal to legal reality. Now here's something else that deserves attention. In my legal analysis, one of the most dangerous mindsets is overconfidence. The belief that I know my rights without continuously updating that knowledge. Because rights don't usually disappear overnight. They shift at the edges. They evolve in application. And those small shifts are where mistakes happen. Courts would likely not evaluate your confidence. They will evaluate your compliance. And that is a completely different standard. So as we move forward in this discussion, the focus should not be fear or frustration. It should be clarity. Clarity about what the law says. Clarity about how it is applied. Clarity about how to operate safely within it. Because in a system like this, clarity is protection. And without it, even well-intentioned actions can lead to unintended consequences. Take a moment and think about that. How much of what you believe about the law is based on current, verified information? And how much of it is based on assumptions? That gap matters. It matters more than most people realize. And it's exactly where legal problems begin. So stay sharp, stay informed, and approach this topic with the level of seriousness it deserves. Because at the end of the day, the difference between being lawful and being at risk is often not what you do. It's what you don't know. Now let's bring everything together, because by this point, you're not just hearing about a legal update, you're starting to see a pattern that explains how rights, laws, and real-world situations intersect in ways that aren't always obvious, but always important. Think about everything we've discussed so far. Not dramatic violations, not reckless behavior, but small details, interpretations, locations, timing, and how each of these factors can quietly shape the outcome of a situation. In my legal analysis, the most important realization is this: the law is not just written, it is applied. And how it is applied can change over time, sometimes faster than people expect. Now let's talk about what this means moving forward, because the question is no longer what changed. The real question is, how do you stay protected in a system that keeps evolving? The answer is not complicated, but it does require discipline. First, you have to shift your mindset. Instead of asking, "Am I allowed to do this?" start asking, "Under what conditions is this allowed?" That small shift in thinking changes everything, because most legal issues don't come from the action itself. They come from ignoring the conditions attached to it. Courts would likely examine not just whether you acted, but whether you acted within the full framework of the law. And that framework includes details that are often overlooked. Second, understand that information has a shelf life. What was accurate last year may not be accurate today. What you heard from a friend, what you saw online, what you assumed based on past experience, none of that replaces verified, current knowledge. In my legal analysis, one of the strongest forms of protection is not a defense strategy. It's staying updated before anything happens. Because once a situation escalates, your ability to control the outcome becomes limited. Third, recognize the difference between confidence and certainty. Confidence is what you feel. Certainty is what the law supports. And those two things are not always the same. There is a strong constitutional argument that laws should be clear and understandable. But in practice, not every situation feels clear in the moment. That's why caution is not weakness, it's strategy. Now let's take a realistic look at where things are heading. The legal landscape around firearms is not static. It is influenced by court decisions, legislative changes, and shifting public priorities. Some changes expand rights, others refine them, and some introduce new layers of responsibility. Courts would likely continue to play a major role in defining these boundaries, especially when constitutional questions are involved. But as those decisions unfold, one thing remains constant. The responsibility to comply exists in the present moment, not after a future ruling, and that's why awareness is not optional. Now, it's also important to acknowledge something fairly. Supporters of evolving regulations often argue that adjustments are necessary to address modern challenges and improve public safety. And from a policy standpoint, that argument exists for a reason. At the same time, there's a strong constitutional argument that any regulation must respect the core protections guaranteed by the Constitution. Balancing these two perspectives is not easy, and that's exactly why this conversation continues, both in courts and in public discourse. But regardless of where someone stands on that spectrum, the one thing that applies to everyone is this: the law, as it exists today, is what governs your actions today. And that brings us back to the most practical takeaway of all. If you are a lawful gun owner, your greatest protection is not just your intent, it's your understanding. Understanding where the boundaries are, understanding how they are applied, understanding how quickly they can shift. Because in my legal analysis, the people who avoid legal trouble are not just those who follow the law, they are the ones who understand it at a deeper level. So before you move on from this video, take a second and reflect, not emotionally, but logically. Are you fully updated on the laws that apply to you right now? Or are you relying on what you think you know? Because that difference matters. It matters in ways that don't show up until they do. And when they do, it's often too late to go back and fix it. That's why conversations like this are important. Not to create fear, not to take sides, but to create awareness, to encourage responsibility, to build understanding, so people can make informed decisions before they ever find themselves in a difficult situation. If you found this breakdown valuable, take it seriously, stay informed, stay responsible, and stay engaged in a way that adds clarity, not confusion. And now I want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What topics should we break down in the next video? Should we go deeper into constitutional rights, real-life case examples, or specific state laws explained step by step? Your input matters, because this channel is built to give you the knowledge that actually protects you. Make sure you subscribe, press the bell icon, and stay connected for more clear, balanced, and legally grounded content. Because at the end of the day, knowing the law isn't just about information, it's about staying one step ahead of the consequences.